So the humorist Will Rogers once said this about one of the men at the very center of our story today. And you know what? He actually meant it as a compliment. It was a tribute to a salesman so unbelievably brilliant, he could basically conjure a paradise out of mud and mangroves, and then sell that dream to an entire nation that was just desperate to believe. But what happens when the tide goes out? What happens when that real estate sign topples over, and you realize the sand it was built on was never really there to begin with?
Today, we are diving deep into a wild story of visionaries, con men, and the absolutely spectacular financial fever dream that was the 1920s Florida land boom. This is a story about how a handful of ambitious, brilliant guys, the Swamp Kings, built an empire on nothing more than sunshine and salesmanship, creating fortunes that seemed to literally appear out of thin air. And more importantly, it's the story of how it all came crashing down in one of the most dramatic financial collapses in American history.
All right, to really get a handle on the boom, we've actually got to start with the bust, a paradise completely lost. I want you to imagine you're standing in South Florida in late 1926. The air, which was once thick with the smell of money and limitless optimism, now just hangs heavy with the smell of ruin. The party is officially over. A dream built with hundreds of millions of dollars and the hopes of a nation has been utterly shattered. So how did it happen? How did the surest bet in America become a total national tragedy?
I mean, what you would have seen were just the skeletons of that dream. Places like Aladdin City and Point Siena, once plastered all over newspapers as the next great American towns, are now just empty streets and half-built houses being slowly swallowed back up by the swamp. Banks that held the life savings of thousands have signs slapped on the door, closed. And the fortunes? We're talking tens of millions of dollars, enough to make men into kings? Gone. Just vanished, as if they were never even real. So what in the world happened here?
Okay, so to figure out the collapse, let's rewind. Let's go all the way back to the beginning, selling the dream in the Roaring Twenties. The Great War was over, the economy was absolutely booming, and this new kind of wild optimism was sweeping across America. For the very first time, regular folks felt like they could get rich. It was a time of just boundless confidence. And Florida? Well, Florida was about to become the ultimate stage for it all. You see, before the 1920s, Florida was, well, it was a sleepy, swampy state, kind of a frontier outpost, the kind of place you went if you were very rich, very old, or very sick. But then, bam, everything changed. Thanks to this new thing called welfare capitalism, the American middle class suddenly had paid vacations, a little extra income, and, most importantly, the automobile. The car made America mobile. All of a sudden, Florida wasn't just for the elite. It was being sold as a sun-drenched playground for everybody.
And who was doing all this selling? Well, they were the Swamp Kings. Now, these weren't your typical con men, at least not at first. They were entrepreneurs with these impossibly huge visions. You had Carl Fisher, who'd already made a fortune in car headlights and built the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. He looked at a mosquito-infested mangrove swamp and somehow saw Miami Beach. George Merrick inherited his family's citrus farm and imagined Coral Gables, a perfectly planned city beautiful. And Addison Misner, a society architect, designed Boca Raton to be the most luxurious resort imaginable. They weren't just selling land, they were selling a complete fantasy.
And these guys were absolute geniuses at marketing. Take Carl Fisher. He puts up this massive lighted billboard right in the middle of New York's Times Square. Just imagine you're a New Yorker, trudging through the freezing slush in February. You look up, and through all the cold and the dark, you see this simple, brilliant message: it's June in Miami. I mean, come on. It was an irresistible promise. The whole country was completely captivated.
And you know what? That promise, that brilliant marketing, it didn't just bring in a few tourists. Oh no. It lit a speculative fire that just spread like a virus across the entire country. The dream of a vacation home very quickly turned into the dream of a quick fortune. The Florida fever was on, and it turned a land boom into a full-blown mania.
The velocity here is it's staggering. A 440% population explosion in just 5 years. This wasn't steady growth, this was a human tidal wave. People from all over the country sold their businesses, quit their jobs, cashed in their life savings, and just flooded into South Florida, absolutely convinced they were about to strike it rich. The state was electric, like a gold rush. So, on the ground, the real foot soldiers of this boom were these guys they called binder boys. These were thousands of young, slick salesmen who would take a binder, basically a small 10% down payment, on a plot of land. You had 30 days to pay the rest. But here's the really wild part. That little binder receipt, that piece of paper, it became a form of currency. You could use it to get credit at hotels, restaurants, shops. The system wasn't just selling land, it was manufacturing its own money out of pure hype.
So what was the financial engine behind all this madness? Well, it was pretty simple and pretty crazy. The banks were just handing out credit, no questions asked. A staggering 2/3 of all property was sold through the mail sight unseen to people in Ohio who'd never even been to Florida. The whole game was about flipping. You'd put 10% down, and before your 30-day payment was even due, you'd sell it to the next guy for a huge profit. The newspapers fanned the flames. The Miami Herald got so thick with real estate ads, it became the heaviest newspaper in the entire country.
You know, an environment this wild, this disconnected from reality, it's like a paradise for grifters. And in 1925, the king of them all shows up. Fresh out of federal prison for that infamous scheme that now bears his name, Charles Ponzi saw the madness in Florida and knew he had found his next big stage. He was the ultimate predator, drawn to the ultimate feeding frenzy. And get this, Ponzi didn't even try to hide who he was. He formed the Charpon land syndicate and promised investors tiny lots near Jacksonville for just $10. He even had the nerve to claim he'd use the profits to pay back the people he'd swindled before. The reality? Well, the land was 65 miles from Jacksonville, deep in a rural county, and when investigators finally went to check it out, they found that much of it was actual, literal swampland. It was the perfect metaphor for the boom's fatal flaw. The hype had become completely unmoored from reality.
But even while this massive party was raging, you could start to see some serious cracks in the foundation of this financial paradise. By late 1925, that manic optimism was starting to feel fragile. The music was still playing, sure, but the smartest people in the room were quietly starting to look for the exits. They were getting very, very nervous.
And this wasn't some Monday morning quarterbacking, you know? This was Forbes magazine in 1925 basically screaming a warning to the entire country. They said flat out that Florida land had no real value. Its price was based only on the hope that a bigger sucker would always come along tomorrow. For anyone who was paying attention, the warning shots were being fired loud and clear. And then, the state's actual physical infrastructure, it just broke. So many building materials were being shipped to Florida that the rail lines got hopelessly clogged. In October 1925, the big railroads just declared an embargo, refusing to carry anything but the essentials. Then, in this moment of almost comical disaster, a ship, the Prince Valdemar, sank and got stuck sideways right in the entrance to Miami's harbor, bottling the whole thing up for almost a month. The state was literally choking on its own success. So the momentum was gone. The supply of new money, of new buyers, the suckers, it was drying up fast. The bubble was leaking air. You could just hear it hissing as the pressure escaped. All it needed was one final decisive pinprick to burst completely. And in September of 1926, Mother Nature delivered a cannonball.
The Great Miami Hurricane was one of the most destructive storms in American history. It just flattened Miami Beach. But more importantly, it completely shattered the illusion of a risk-free paradise. Any little bit of enthusiasm left for Florida real estate was, quite literally, washed away by the storm surge. The hurricane didn't cause the crash, but it was the tombstone. The boom was officially over.
And the financial carnage was, well, it was immediate. Just look at that spike. Bank deposits in Florida more than tripled in a single year, rocketing from $251 million to $830 million. That was the fuel for the fire. But after the hurricane, confidence just evaporated. Newcomers fled the state, pulling their money with them, and the entire banking system was drained of its capital almost overnight.
So now we're back where we started, standing in the middle of all that wreckage. We've seen the hype, we've seen the hurricane, but there's one more hidden piece to this financial puzzle that explains why the collapse was so total, so devastating. It wasn't just bad luck or an act of God. It was rotten, fraudulent banking at the very core of the whole system.
What researchers eventually figured out is that most of the banks that went under weren't just random failures. No, they were part of a single massive network, the Manly Anthony Bank Chain. This whole chain was built on a foundation of incredibly risky and, often fraudulent insider lending. The bankers were basically using their depositors' money to fund their own speculative real estate deals. And this hidden connection meant that when one bank got into trouble, it threatened to bring the entire system down with it.
And this just set off the ultimate domino effect. Okay, so first, the hurricane kills confidence. The outside buyers vanish, so the speculators can't flip their properties anymore and start defaulting. This bankrupts the big developers. Carl Fisher and George Merrick lost everything. And then, the rot at the financial core is exposed as the Manly Anthony chain collapses, taking the life savings of thousands of families down with it. The result? Florida plunged into a deep depression a full 3 years before the rest of the country.
You know, in the end, this quote from a local realtor just says it all perfectly. The developers and the promoters who started the whole thing, the men who thought they were masters of the universe, they ended up getting caught in their own trap. They created a game so speculative that eventually they were the only ones left playing, just trading worthless paper promises back and forth. They became the final suckers.
Look, this isn't just some quirky story from 100 years ago. It's a timeless blueprint for a financial bubble. You have a compelling news story, easy credit, and this mass delusion that prices can only go up, which really leaves us with a pretty stark question. When we look at the speculative manias of our own time, have we really learned the lessons of the Swamp Kings, or are we just waiting for the next hurricane?